So I just want to dive right in. So I just want to start by addressing the person who maybe is the elephant in the room for a lot of folks who think about women in philanthropy, and that is Mackenzie Scott, who of course is the billionaire philanthropist, ex-wife of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. So she's been making big waves in philanthropy over the past 2 years with an unconventional style that involves giving out large sums, unrestricted grants, trust-based philanthropy, and focusing a lot on women-led organizations, grassroots-led organizations. And so I just wanted to ask, and we can start with you, Kavita, because I know that as former president of the Global Fund for Women, you have a lot of experience here. Do you see her as blazing a new trail for women in philanthropy? And if so, what are some of the implications you see coming out of this?
Thank you, and thank you everyone at Devex. It's great to be on this panel. I think Mackenzie Scott is important because of what she signifies primarily for private individuals of wealth and the way in which they approach their work. I think with regard to trust-based philanthropy, women's funds like the Global Fund for Women and Mama Cash and Semillas in Mexico and the Ukrainian Women's Fund, there are so many of them that have actually pioneered giving on the basis of trust. And as Justine and I were talking about earlier, the ability for these smaller sums of money to reach grassroots-based organizations, which women's funds have been able to do in really remarkable ways, I think that has long preceded the kind of recognition and visibility that someone like a Mackenzie Scott has received. But do I think it's not important? No, I actually think she's made an important challenge for the rest of philanthropy, which also, as we have discussed, has recently been, I often think that closing down women's rights programs inside big foundations can be sort of like how arts and music gets cut from the public school budget. So I think in contrast, Mackenzie has played an important role in that respect. But I know my colleagues will have their thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what makes her stand out is the scale that she gives at. But you asked about the implications, and I don't think we know what the implications are going to be of the massive amounts of money that she's put into a system that needs it, but may not know exactly how to manage it. And so I think what these organizations that receive this money do with it and how they manage it will be part of her legacy.
Right. So accountability in this case is probably going to be, and transparency about how the money is being spent. And I know that some groups that have received funding from her have already started to do that.
Yeah. It's a big responsibility to receive that amount of money, but
I think it's also a good thing, especially for women-led and BIPOC-led organizations, which for a long time haven't been trusted with big money. Yeah. So there's also a statement, that's part of that.
Exactly.
And I do think like the opportunity of reaching those local organizations, I think you can see through her giving that it's continued to refine and go more local. Yeah. But the whole idea of trust-based philanthropy is to reach these orgs that don't have the opportunity or infrastructure to even access these kinds of funds. So hopefully she continues to improve that.
Yeah, and I guess we'll see. I know that she is supposed to create a website at some point, and she's going to have a lot more information there. But I wanted to go back to something you just mentioned, Kavita. You talked about, women's programs within foundations. And we're, of course, talking a few weeks after in the U.S., the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, removing federal protections for abortion rights. And I wonder if, in looking at this moment, if you're seeing any missed opportunities in philanthropy, moments where maybe there could have been more funding for that, and how you sort of reshape strategies in the wake of that, because of course this is a U.S. situation, but it has widespread implications. The U.S., of course, is very influential. So,
I don't know, do you want to jump into that, Jennifer?
I'm happy to jump in. Funding for reproductive health is about 86% of all funding for women and girls, period, in the US. But in the US, only 1.6% of all giving goes to women and girls. So there has been money going there. It's just never been enough money. And so I do think that what we need is more funding going into policy, into getting women into leadership positions, into places where they have power and voice to change policy. And we do need more funders, both men and women, coming to the table on all issues related to gender, but particularly women. We need men at the table.
And I would add, like, the global layer of this, at the Clara Lionel Foundation, we have funded reproductive health clinic infrastructure projects in the Caribbean for a long time as part of our climate resilience work. And, to the stat about the amount of funding happening in the US, we would see after natural disasters that so little funding would go to support women and girls. And then on top of it, these reproductive health clinics wouldn't open for years. So just that lack of access to these basic health services was not there. And so we did make it a priority a long time ago to continue to fund this and to make sure that women have this continuous access, but it's because we've always believed that this is about healthcare. And I think that's an important thing to come back to. It's sometimes when you put it in the bucket of women and girls, we're not seeing funders step up. So
yeah, I mean, it's kind of fascinating to me that, people see women and girls as like a niche population, and I'm like, wait, we're half of the world, and we produce the other
more than
half.
Yeah.
So, like, how does this become kind of like that's a special interest group? I'm like, no, actually, the issues that we care about are all the issues we all care about, and so whether it's climate resilience or whether it's peace and security or whether it's the survival of democracy. I mean, at the Open Society Foundations, we were arguing strongly that the battleground for democratic rights and challenging authoritarianism begins with our bodies. And the fact that there is an effort to control our bodies, literally control our bodies. How many laws are there that control men's bodies? And that is, I think, something that we also need to shift, is appreciating the ways in which these struggles are not just struggles that, quote unquote, affect some small group of specialized people. They actually are struggles that profoundly affect the ability for us to have free and just societies anywhere in the world.
Yeah, and I think, I think you raised an interesting point, and that's something I've heard quite a bit about the philanthropy sector in general, is this tendency to silo issues in areas. And Jennifer, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how the Gates Foundation is integrating and including gender equity in its overall mission, including health and other programs that it's working on.
Yeah, so gosh, I think about 8 years ago, Melinda came to the foundation and said, we're going to start integrating gender into all of our programs. We're going to take a gender lens. And nobody knew exactly what that meant at that point. But we've started to do it over the years, and it's taken time, and not all of our programs have gotten there. But over time, you're seeing that come into every program, every grant that we make. And as long as you know that it does take time, it's really important. I think that also led to the creation of our gender equality division, which most recently has started to bring in parts of our global health division. And bringing that together is so critical for women, because it's not just, it's not just women and advocacy, it's about their health, it's about their communities, it's about their kids. And so the fact that we can bring this together and really focus on it holistically is a huge shift for the foundation, and it's really exciting.
I think it's exciting also. I would say the Global Fund for Women was an early grantee of the Gates Foundation at a different moment, and I think it's been exciting to see the trajectory, as Jennifer said. So there's another side, just as Mackenzie Scott's philanthropy has been a positive. I think the fact that the Gates Foundation has prioritized and openly started speaking about the importance of investing in feminist movements, that's a big shift. It's a big shift to have Melinda be, an open proponent for both family planning and now women's rights over their own bodies. And so, I think it's fair to say we've had both positive trajectories in philanthropy as well as continued challenges. So.
I think it's so well said. Like we have to be mindful in philanthropy of sometimes getting lost in the intersectionality. Like I feel like that's how even Prime Minister Trudeau, with his government and Gates Foundation, all that was happening. It felt like putting the gender lens on is wonderful, but then I just worry that we get lost in not actually prioritizing it.
I think it's a both and.
Yeah.
I think we need both and.
Totally.
We need a gender lens across all our programs, and we need independent, strong, well-funded women's rights programs in foundations that can actually get money directly to women and girls. So.
Totally.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, you talk about people sort of making statements about gender inequity, and I think that's something, we've seen a lot in the past couple of years, and as a lot of foundations have also focused on social justice and climate justice, you hear these things a lot, but I think there's also the questions about the follow-up with the commitments. People say they're going to pledge, 1.2 billion or however much money, but then what happens? And I think that is something that has been concerning, at least what I hear from grantees, is that, such and such foundation said they were going to do this, but we don't actually know how the money is going to be spent. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how, philanthropists and women in philanthropy can kind of push for that type of transparency and to make sure that, a lot of these pledges actually are followed up on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah.
Go ahead, Justine.
I mean, I think this panel is so interesting because, I don't know, just looking at how women are playing a role in philanthropy, I think we lead with our value set and we prioritize things like transparency, like multi-year grants, thinking about how we can engage in trust-based philanthropy, but also measure impact. I think there's a lot that can be done and a lot that we can champion and lead with.
Yeah, and I also feel like there's also a way in which the, it's not just entering the spaces, you said the accountability. So there's a lot of going to big events and making, as you said, the big pronouncements and the pledges. And then there's not so much on the kind of who's holding the feet to the fire. And I think part of that is for the people who are on the receiving end of grants, people who raise money, it's awfully hard to hold the people who are going to make your next grant to you, quote unquote, accountable. And there is no other form of accountability. That is a challenge with private philanthropy in a most profound way. They're not democratically elected. These are often incredibly wealthy people who have lives that are very different from the kinds of people who they're giving grants to, presumably to upend the very system that made them as wealthy as they were, right? So, I mean, this is just a fact, and we have to kind of acknowledge that there's that internal contradiction. And then, therefore, I feel like we need more support on the accountability front from that we build into foundations ourselves. We have to take that responsibility if we're on the funding end, and not say that, well, I mean, our grantees, they could be, and it's no, that's not on them. That's on us. That's on us as funders to do more of that.
I think we can't be susceptible to moments too, because all the examples you just gave, George Floyd's murder happens, there's this big amount of philanthropy that happens around racial justice, but then that sort of fell off. We're sitting in a moment of reproductive justice. We can't just this year be funding it. We have to be thinking about the long-term strategies and how we can continue to accelerate policy change and
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, I do think so much of philanthropy is private, though. So much comes from donor-advised funds and anonymous donors that it can't be tracked, but it is going to these things. Mm-hmm. But it's another way that people give and are trying to move things forward, but they're doing it in a trust-based philanthropy type of way. But then you get the criticism of donor-advised funds not being transparent, but still the funds are going out the door. So it becomes really important, I think, both from a donor perspective, if they're comfortable sharing, but also from an organization perspective of saying, here's what we received and here's how we're spending it, and making sure that you're also building that trust back into donors' coming back to you and building that relationship over time.
Right. And I imagine that is really important in terms of maintaining public trust. You know, I recently wrote a story, the Center for Effective Philanthropy and others were talking about the fact that public trust in foundations and in philanthropists was eroding. And a lot of that is because people will assume that maybe some of these philanthropists have other alternative ideas that they're trying to push, or that they just don't know how the money is being spent. And so, yeah, I think there are those questions about that. And in some ways, maybe it would serve the philanthropy community to be more transparent if, you have people willing to do that.
Yeah, and I think we do need probably this is not going to make me very popular with philanthropists, but I do think that the conversations around more regulation are valid. I actually think that this is a huge tax break for incredibly wealthy people, and they actually should be held to more account. And frankly, inside a democracy, since this is in particular in the United States, where in the rest of the world, people think that paying taxes is actually a good way of maintaining your democracy and actually putting that money out into the larger community and redistributing wealth. Somehow in the US, we haven't gotten that message yet. But I think there is therefore even more reason for our legislatures to hold philanthropy to account, because I actually don't think you make 70% in a good year if the market is great, and then you're only expected to pay out 5% of your earnings. I think that's crazy. People have made billions and billions of dollars in the last few years, and all these endowments of private foundations particularly. Mackenzie Scott is actually richer now after having given away all that amount of money than she was when she began. That's the degree of inequality we have in our societies, and philanthropy is not enough to fix that.
So I know we're running low on time, and I want to just get in a final question. But, I think my question, because we have talked a lot about gender inequity, and I wanted to ask, because I feel like there is a pressure that's put on women in philanthropy to talk about certain issues because you are representative of a particular group. And I wonder if, one, you think that's fair, like women should be the ones out there leading the call for more funding for gender inequity. And if there are other areas, though, that you see an opportunity for women to also pursue, or other areas where you sort of see those intersections, as Justine mentioned, like climate resilience is one area I'm thinking where you can bring in those two and connect them. So yeah, I guess I'll start with you, Justine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, just looking at what happened with Roe v. Wade, I feel like every woman in the United States was sort of raising their voice, but I saw a lot of memes out there that were saying, like, with men, if they were silent, that's being complicit. And I do think that there is absolutely a role for men to step up in this space, and we shouldn't have to carry the burden of taking on these issues. I do think, something that we've always looked at CLF is that intersectionality, and our founder being from the Caribbean, like, we obviously sit in her value set, and the fact that her family still lives in Barbados, and so we're always looking at how can we help support the issues that community faces, and it's beyond gender. It's the intersection of climate. It's looking at things like the effects of the colonial past of that region, and it's so complicated. But gender always seems to be something that cuts across all of our work without us even thinking about it. So, I mean, I do think that the burden shouldn't be on us as women, but I think also we should look at the values that we have as women in the work that we're doing, and how do we carry that forward and look at how it intersects with all the other issues that we're taking on. So just how you're talking about the Gates Foundation approach, it feels like it sits true with an approach that works well.
Yeah, I mean, what doesn't gender touch?
Yeah.
It's all intersectional, isn't it? I mean, women are at the center of so many things. I mean, I don't think that women philanthropists only have to advocate for women and girls, but women and girls are integrated into everything, and so you can't help but talk about it. I also think that, well, we know the data tells us that women give with empathy. They give with their hearts. And so they will look at things from that perspective and give to it. And they give to women and girls. They give to lots of different things. But I think what I would love to see is for it not just being women standing up and talking about women and girls. We need men at the table. And until that happens, we're going to be, 4 women on a stage without a man here talking about gender. And next year, I'd love to see a man up here saying that he's the funder of gender programs.
I think also I would add that LGBT and queer movements and challenges to our binaries have helped us a lot. I think in the feminist movement, I find it very liberating that they've created a space for us to be able to think in a way that actually brings that in. In Ireland, one of the women's rights movements for free and legal abortion that the Women's Rights Program at the Open Society Foundations was proud to be able to support, queer activists were deeply in sync with women's rights activists. And it was a joint effort because, as you can see from Roe v. Wade, this is just the tip of the iceberg. They're not just going after women. They're going after anybody who is different, doesn't fit into the mold, doesn't fit into some kind of categorization. And I think we should all be really ready for the fact that we are going to see an attack on LGBT rights, and we owe that community a huge debt of gratitude, I think, in the women's movement to have opened up our understanding of feminism in a way. For me, feminism has nothing to do with what's between your legs. It has to do with what's between your ears. And as far as I'm concerned, everybody should be a feminist. So.
Well, and on that note, I want to thank you all so much for being here. And thank you all for listening to this conversation on women in philanthropy.